My talk is on the flying spaghetti monster. Do we have a coherent concept of God? There was a time when I was at the university at Cal State Fulton that I felt prey to, well, maybe we don't have a coherent concept of God. Maybe God is just an absurd statement like a blick. Or maybe a definition of absurdity would be green thoughts sleep furiously. That's absurd, right? So God talk, such as God exists, God answers prayers, Jesus was historically raised from the dead, sure, it may have emotive significance. It may be a fine opinion, but other than that, it says nothing about the actual world. In the late 19th century, the German philologist Friedrich Nietzsche made the statement in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that God is dead and we have killed him, leaving it open for man to be a god to themselves. The death of God, then, according to Nietzsche, leaves room for him to open new values instilled and motivated by the will to power. He called the Ubermensch, or the Overman, or the Superman, who is to replace God. God stands over mankind with a thou shalt not. So then Nietzsche proposes a celebration of the new generation and greatness of man. Man is free from such imposed objective realities. As much as Nietzsche celebrates this climatic freedom, there is also a real anticlimatic to this. The loss of an objective value system from a great being, maker of all reality, to that now determined by the will of the person. So if you're giving rid of an objective standard, the ground of all being, a ground of all morality and objectivity, then the sole individual is the ground of all being, objectivity, and a relativistic value of meaning and purpose. And so then it's up to the individual to decide for themselves what is right or wrong. And so there is on that view, no real objective truth, such as it is wrong to harm the innocent, because it's just based upon the individual who gets to decide on their own feelings and psychosocial history what they say goes. Postmodernism, then. There is a reconstruction of language, morals, and meaning in our society. Truth is relative. God is whatever you want it to be. The Bible is your own interpretation. They would hold that the New Testament itself is not reliable at all. The only thing absolute is love. How do we respond to a relativistic, postmodern, and atheistic culture? Lucky that Jason Jackson is going to give us an argument of morality for God's existence, and Nathan Liddell would give us more on, can we defend absolute truth? Aristotle, beginning in his book, which is called The Metaphysics, is a study of what is real, says, all men by nature desire to know. Talking about explanation of the phenomenon that we experience around us, there's things that we want to know. We seek an explanation for things. Children know this very early on an early age, when they, with repeated succession, ask the question, why? Why? Ad infinity, ad absurdum. They keep asking why. From a very strong age, people want to know the explanation of things. First, let me define then the philosophy of religion. Philosophy of religion is a subdivision of philosophy that uses analytical methods to examine arguments for and against God's existence and whether or not it's coherent. One problem in the philosophy of religion has to do with the coherence of theism. Is theistic truth claims coherent? Is the concept of God coherent? More specifically, the concept of God, that the notion of God is incoherent for the atheist, and for the theist, those who believe in one God, we would say that we have a coherent concept of God. Many Christians do not necessarily need a justification for the acceptance of God's existence and his authoritative word. I don't believe that you need to have reasons for what you believe for. I believe it's finally acceptable for a Christian to just read the Bible and come to the conclusion that, yes, his word is authoritative, God does exist, and I believe in Jesus Christ, and put their faith in God. But I'm talking about apologetics, and I'm talking about my own personal experience, and I'm talking about when you respond to those who do bring arguments against God, what's going to be your response? If someone doesn't believe in the concept of God, if they don't believe in that his word is even authoritative, why would you ever say, well, John 3:16 says? If they don't believe that Jesus Christ was a historical person and that he rose from the dead or had any supernatural influence upon this universe, why would you say, Jesus Christ rose from the dead and died for you? How can we get them to understand that there are logical reasons to believe in God? And then from there, you could start going and talking about, well, does the Bible have the properties that makes it authoritative? That Jesus Christ actually revealed God in the flesh, and so on and so forth. But we start with apologetics. Apologetics is a task of defending and showing the facts of the Christian truth amidst a secular culture. So I personally find apologetics vital to the life of the church, and not only to the life of the church, but to those who are seeking for meaning, purpose, and life. What I want to do in this talk is to give a philosophical analysis of the concept of God. The problem of religious language in the philosophy of religion, the assertion has been made by some in this field that creedal statements, theological propositions, are not the same as statements about facts of the world, nor are they worthy of communication to that of how we normally communicate, nor can they be verified and falsified like scientific theories. In short, they say nothing about the world or any world. They are incoherent. The modern conception of God, then. The philosopher Spinoza, in his theological political treatise, says that the biblical authors imagine God as ruler, legislator, king, merciful, just, etc., despite the fact that all the latter are merely attributes of human nature and far removed from the divine nature. Feuerbach, in the 19th century, said that in his Essence of Christianity, that God is a mere psychological projection of man's inward nature. And so we just sort of project this idea of God based upon our own nature. Process theology says that the philosophical theological position that the only thing absolute in existence is change, and therefore God is constantly changing and may be changing with the universe. Then we have liberal theologies, then we have psychological Freudian theory. Religion was a great hindrance to society, and so out to prove that it is merely a product of the mind, an illusion. God, as a projection of the unconscious mind, it's a mere wish fulfillment. And so we adopt religion. And when we adopt religion, we're reverting back to our childish patterns of thought when confronted with feelings of helplessness, guilt, and a need for security. It's a mere childish delusion. And in a sociological construct, some would say that religion may be good for society, and it may instill some values, meanings, and purpose, and it's okay for you, for that individual, for your neighbor, for the churchgoer, but it's not absolute, and you cannot know any of it by fact. It's only a mere opinion and feelings. And now we have the concept of a flying spaghetti monster. The flying spaghetti monster would be a deity in a creation story. This story was created in response to the Kansas school board trying to change teaching guidelines so that intelligent designs would be taught alongside evolution in public school science classrooms. One person said, if intelligent design can be taught in schools as a scientific theory, then so can the flying spaghetti monster theory. And what that is flying spaghetti monster is just this purity of our belief in God. So where we say we believe God is and has all these various properties or characteristics as taught in the Bible, and not just that, I think there's also logical properties you could bring out by analytical arguments. Not only that, though, they would say, okay, then we might as well believe in the flying spaghetti monster. And then can someone believe in that? If we're going to teach this absurd theory as intelligent designed, any theory is just as viable. There's also even a church of the flying spaghetti monster, in which they're called Pastafarians. And one wonders, do they have like a cousin ramen? Anyways, that sounds good right now. So one wonders, though, it's a complete satirical parody of the Christian faith. Whenever you hear this concept, it's interesting. Yesterday, when Jim was talking about this subject, he's like, who's heard of the flying spaghetti monster? And the adults? The kids, though. All these kids? You see, one may not find apologetics useful. Maybe you are sitting there going like, why do I care about apologetics? I already believe in God. This isn't for you. This is for the children who is going to meet the soapbox version of a professor in philosophy, psychology, sociology, physics, biology, X, whatever, who's going to say, you have an incoherent concept of reality. There is no such thing as God. The Bible is filled with millions and billions and all these errors. You cannot know anything since men are liable of error, and they wrote the Bible, therefore the Bible's an error. Okay, good job with that. They're going to meet that version of a professor. I met that version of a professor. And so when they're going through their various doubts of Christianity, they're not going to have the preacher with them. They're not going to have their elder. They're not going to have their friend. They're not going to have their favorite apologist. just them and the professor. And since they're trying to get their degrees, and the professor, it's at a time in their lives where various changes are going on, and they're trying to go out through their careers. And since that professor has a connection to their major, a connection to their future self in a various field, guess who they're going to love more? The professor. So do you think it's important that we teach children how to confront arguments against the existence of God? Well, that's just a philosophical argument. It says nothing about now those in the church are acting like agnostics and atheists because they don't want to hear about any arguments for God. So this talk is mostly for the children. And it's also for you because you also can appreciate the fact that, hey, we have good arguments for the existence of God. So this flying spaghetti monster satirical parody is saying basically Christianity is nonsense. What's interesting is that, well, even if we did believe in a flying spaghetti monster who created all matter, time, and space, wouldn't that be God? And so therefore we're justified in believing in God. I am not saying we believe in the flying spaghetti monster, by the way. First then, what does theist mean? Someone that believes in one God who is the creator of our ultimate cause of all things. He's not physical like the flying spaghetti monster. Second, what does the word God mean? Or what does it refer to? Richard Swinburne says, a person without a body, that is a spirit, who is eternal, free, able to do anything, knows everything, is perfectly good, is a proper object of human worship and obedience, the creator and sustainer of the universe. Whether such statements that religious people assert are claims of truth, whether it is a claim to which is coherent or not, a claim which makes sense so as to be true, I think we can make those claims about religious statements, and I'll briefly talk about that. There are some claims that are, in its combinatorial sense, use of claims says something about the word, but it may become incoherent. Just because I could say something doesn't mean that it's true or not. For example, I may say the word smigalo. It's possible to utter a meaningless sentence and assert meaningless claims. This means that they're incoherent. Some may be grammatically true, but it is coherently true? That's the question. So even though a claim may be grammatically true, it also may be incoherent. For example, Mike is over 6 feet tall and under 5 foot tall. Grammatically, that's correct, but it's incoherent, right? The problem then, human language and the infinite. How can finite minds understand an infinite mind? How can finite concepts grasp an infinite concept? We are finite beings. God is an infinite being. This is known as a problem in the philosophy of religion known as the problem of religious language. Philosophers care about this because they care about meaning in any form and whether it is coherent, whether analytic statements make sense. They're analytic philosophers, and the modern philosopher or the philosopher of religion analyzes and evaluates religious beliefs. Beliefs are expressed in the form of statements or propositions. We, as Christians, believe in a series of propositions that God exists, that the Bible is the Word of God, that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and so on and so forth. Any statement you make in reality are called propositions. So speaking analogically then about God, when we say that God has eyes and that God loves us, and we are speaking analogically to what we know of human experience. The philosopher, the medieval theologian, philosophical theologian Thomas Aquinas held that when the word is applied to contingent beings, that is created beings, us, when we say that God is just, for example, it is not being used univocally, that is exactly with the same meaning, in the two instances, nor is it being used equivocally with two completely different meanings. What we are saying is that they are being used analogically. When we say that God is just, we have a comprehension and understanding of what the word just means, correct? But we are using it in terms of the concept of God in an infinite sense, that he is more just. We completely understand the coherent concept of what it means to be just. And so we just multiply that to a great being such as God, who would have a greater, intensified value of being just. Any worldview that we come to criticize or we come to investigate or evaluate must have a criteria of knowing. For any explanatory hypothesis or worldview of ultimate things, such as the explanation of the beginning of the universe, must adhere to the principles of the laws of logic. And what are those? The first law is the law of identity. A is A. All true propositions are true and vice versa. All false propositions are false. For example, am I truly identified strictly to material brain states, or am I something more, like an immaterial soul? Can a contingent universe be the cause of its own existence? Or does it require a necessary cause that is outside matter, time, and space? The second law, then, the law of non-contradiction. No true contradictory statements can both be true and not true at the same time and the same sense. Many examples abound. For instance, I cannot be here and not here at the same time. It would be a contradiction. Another example, effects cannot both have a cause and a non-cause. Effects or contingent things are not uncaused. Something cannot come from nothing. Now we have the law of excluded middle, which says that something either is or is not. A proposition is either true or false. It is not both. Either God exists or he does not exist. Either effects have causes to them or they do not. Either objective values exist or they do not. All of reality is based upon these laws of logic. And everyone, no matter the atheist, the Christian, the skeptic, the scientist, the philosopher, they all have to ascribe to these laws of logic because that's how we operate in this universe. And we understand what a contradictory statement is. We understand what the law of excluded middle is. And we all live out our lives that way. And so if the worldview is illogical in any sense, then we are to abandon it. There was a time where I was questioning my faith. I was taking philosophy courses. I majored in philosophy and psychology at Cal State Fullerton, just down the street. And little by little, it wasn't just like that, oh, I don't believe in God. No, I was filled with collected doubts. Do we have a coherent concept of God? Is the Bible the Word of God? I don't know. You know, my professors are saying something about God and all God talk. There was even a point to where I believe in a theory of the mind called, I said this already, but called eliminative materialism. And what that theory says is folk psychological talk about consciousness, the soul, mental states are to be eliminated and replaced with an evolutionary or materialistic framework that's best supported by scientific data. I fell into that for some strange reason. I fell into the fact that, well, maybe Daniel Dennett is right, and maybe our consciousness is just mere illusory. And so maybe it's the fact that our consciousness and our mental selves and the self and mental states and the soul, maybe it's just an illusory concept. How we ever know that, I don't know, since our mental states are supposed to be illusory. There was also a time I was deeply eroded in analytic philosophy and the philosophy of mind. And so I thought, wait, there is no such valid proposition as God exists. I was also deeply involved in existentialism. So you can see how they two conflict. Analytic, and then you have existential in terms of being. So, and then from a psychological standpoint, I trusted in B.F. Skinner's behaviorism. And so I was really messed up. There was even time. But the point is, I truly believed all this stuff to be true. See, I wanted to major in philosophy. And so I loved my professors. And so if a professor is telling me that, oh, we have no good arguments for the existence of God, I'm like, you're probably right. You know, there's no one next to me saying, no, you're wrong. I know better now. I actually know that there are very good arguments for the existence of God. We have very strong arguments, philosophical and scientific arguments that God exists. And we can be assured that the Bible is the Word of God and that Jesus Christ did exist. He is a historical figure, and that this is his revealed word and truth, and that God does exist, and that the material soul does exist, and so on. There was even times where we had, in campus, you had what's called Campus Crusade for Christ. Are you guys familiar with that? It's not a Church of Christ sponsored. It's an evangelical approach to bringing God into the schools. So what happened is I would mess around with my so-called philosophical atheism, and they'd come up to me and they'd be like, "Hey, you need God?" I'm like, "Yes, I really do." And then they'll be talking. I'm like, "You're right. It's so meaningless. There's no meaning. I really need God." And then when they get me to accept God, I'm like, "I'm just kidding," and I just walk away. And then there's times where they'd come up to me again, and I would say, like, "Get away from me. I want nothing to do with you. Everything you say is illogical and is meaningless." And so, and I also mess with them, like, you know, it's incoherent, and the point is that I wanted nothing to do with God. So then, do we have a coherent concept of God? First off, let me introduce the ontological argument, or the argument from contingency. This is an old argument from a theologian named Anselm of Canterbury. The universe asserts itself to us. It's here. How did it get here? Two phenomena that we are immediately aware of are that the universe is here, and that we are consciously aware that we are consciously aware. How are these best explained? The reality of an objective world Common sense tells a real world exists. Thomas Reid, a philosopher, in his essays on the intellectual powers of man, said, "A man may as soon be reasoning, by reasoning, pull the moon out of her orbit so as to destroy the belief in the object of sense." Basically, anyone could believe anything they want if they reason themselves to. What he's saying is that during moments of philosophical reasoning, they can argue the real world either exists or does not exist. But that becomes absurd because the world is disclosed to us by our senses, which corresponds to our ideas of things that are in the world. And immediately we are asserted back into the existence of ourselves because we're self-conscious beings, and not only ourselves, but in the existence of an external world. So we know that the world exists. The question is, why is there not nothing? Why is there something? Regarding the beginning of the universe, is this a claim that is not without warrant? No, I think it is a good claim. Something that the religious person just made up that, well, there is existence of universe and it came here to be. No, we all know that the universe exists. How did it get here? We see that there are explanations to things existing in our reality. Why not extend a causal explanation for the beginning of matter, time and space? The ancient pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides of Elea asked the question, why is there not nothing? The opposite of something is nothing. I want to give two arguments for the reality of God and the universe coming to be. That is the answer to why there is something and not nothing. The ontological argument and the argument from contingency. First, the ontological argument, from the idea of God to the reality of a great conceivable being. Anselm gave his famous argument for God's existence in his work, the Proslogion. He reflects on Psalms 14:1 that says, "The fool has said in his heart, there is no God." To deny the existence of the God, the fool must have an idea or an understanding or a concept of God. To Anselm, the idea of God is a being which none greater can be conceived. It goes like this. Premise 1, God is something of which none greater can be thought or conceived. Premise 2, it is greater to exist in reality than in the mind. Premise 3, therefore, God must exist, otherwise he would not be the greatest conceivable possible being. For if something else was greater, then that would be God. But it has to stop somewhere. Can't have an infinite idea and realities of greater upon greater beings. There has to be a conceivably great being, hence that which we call God. Examples. Ideas are representations of actual objects existing in the world. When I perceive an object, my mind has a representation of such object. The reality, therefore, is greater. I may have I may look at this and I go, oh, this is an object. It's a Greek text. The idea of that object is an actual representation of things in the world that exist, but the reality is greater. Didn't the Bible said that what's the shadow and what's greater? Christ, right? The actual greater, the reality. When I perceive an object, my mind has a representation of that object, but the reality, therefore, is the greater. So in arguing for the existence of God, we may have a concept of God, but the reality of God is greater, therefore God must exist. Inherent in the Anselmian concept of God is that he, God, exists necessarily. That is, that it is true in every possible world God exists. God must necessarily exist. That is, that his existence is dependent upon no other, and that he cannot fail to not exist. It's impossible for God to exist only in the understanding of the fool, for that would not be a great being. He must both exist in the mind and also in reality. Unlike unicorns, golden mountains, or perfectly great islands, God must exist necessarily. If the existence is possible, he must be a necessary being. God is something which none greater can be conceived. Since it is greater to exist in reality than in the mind alone, therefore God must exist, otherwise he would not qualify as the greatest conceivable being. To say that God is logically necessary being is to say that God exists in every possible world. When we say every possible world, what we mean is that for all the ways that the world could be, there is a world at which that is the case. God is a proper name and so is rigidly designated in every popular world. God exists as that entity rigidly identified as God, a necessary being. His essential nature is true in existence. In comparison then to contingent beings, we are contingent beings. We owe our existence to a greater being than ourselves. It is greater to exist necessarily than to exist contingently. Since God is not a contingent being, he must exist necessarily. And a necessary being must exist in reality. God, as the greatest conceivable being, then, must be necessity. Such a being is not dependent upon anything outside or influence for its existence. Therefore, God exists. The proposition God exists is true in every possible world. Now then, the argument from contingency. What we see around us is the observable phenomenon in our reality. It opposes its existence upon our senses. We experience a world and other people in that world. We interacted with it. It is bigger than us. It contains us. It was here before any of us, and it will be here when we die away. How is this possible? Did the universe just come into existence uncaused out of nothing? Did it cause itself to be, or was it caused by someone? We have good reasons of a plausible explanation for an immaterial first causal agency responsible for the universe and life within that universe as human persons. God stands in the category of a necessary cause. He is an adequate causal explanation for the universe of all matter, time, and space. The point of these arguments that I'm trying to talk about is if God is an adequate, coherent cause, then we have a coherent concept of God, and then we have a coherent belief in the existence of God. If nothing else can explain the existence of why we are here, why the universe is here, and why beings are here, then it doesn't explain that. And so if God can stand as an adequate explanation, then we are verified, we are justified in believing that God exists as a coherent concept of the explanation of all reality, time, and space, and of our beings. And so we are justified in believing that God exists, and there is no such thing as a flying spaghetti monster. Something exists in the universe. How did it get here? Even science uses such a principle as sufficient reason for the phenomenon that's experienced. They assume that there must be an explanation or a cause for the things to be explained. What we want to do is, how did the universe get here? How did beings get here? Another way to explain being is the following. Thomas Aquinas formulates his argument in this way. We experience in the world motion, that is change, from point A to point B. Things being moved have potentials in themselves and become actualized. When actualized, they moved by something else. For we cannot have our own actualizers or movers. We can't be our own movers if we're contingent upon something to move us, nor have infinite movers, but must arrive as a first mover or cause. We understand then that to be God. Things in the universe are contingent. The universe itself is contingent. It depends upon existence to it to be here. The universe did not have to exist. That's why we know that it has to be contingent. There must be a necessary cause in whose existence is one that cannot fail to exist and never came into being. There must exist a necessary cause. Earlier we said that this was God. The argument for contingency is this. 1, God as a necessary being gives rise or existence to contingent beings, that is us. 2, our very being or existence is contingent upon a necessary, all-sufficient being, in that we are dependent upon an external cause for our existence. Therefore, God as a necessary being is a sufficient reason for our existence. As a necessary being, he sustains all. The cosmological argument then says that since the universe exists, it must have a cause beyond itself. What started all contingent things to exist in the first place? Again, Thomas Aquinas says, he gave 5 arguments for the existence of God, and he says that it is evident to our senses that in the world some things are in motion. How did that motion get here? What brought about that process? Regarding the cosmological argument, Thomas continues that an infinite chain of finite causes is impossible. Otherwise, existentially speaking, how did we ever get here now? Who actualized the potentiality for existence and therefore contingent beings to even be here in existence? Therefore, there must be a first uncaused cause, the originating and sustaining cause of the universe, that which we call God. What's more is that this is also verified by Scripture. Exodus 3:14 says, I am that I am, or I am. The Gospel of John says, the emphatic statement in John 1, verse 3, all things came into being or existence through him, and without him not one thing came into being which has come into being. So the question then, did the universe originate by chance? No, it is logically impossible to argue for the phenomenon of chance as a cause for the universe. Several reasons to this. 1, because chance is a non-entity, that is, without being and all the characteristics associated with metaphysical being. It has no influence on any causal relationship in the universe. Chance doesn't have anything like that. We can cause things to be. We have the property. We have the potentiality to actualize any cause in existence. I can cause a house to erect based upon the fact that I'm going to build it. We have that potential. We can do it. Chance It doesn't have any of that properties or characteristics. So when someone says that the universe came about by chance, that itself is an absurd statement. 2, to say that something is caused by chance, created by chance, came into being by chance, is to argue for the concept of self-creation, a concept that is not philosophically coherent, and that is contrary to reason and a violation of the law of non-contradiction. There is a problem with trying to prescribe causal properties to this phenomenon known as chance. It is incoherent for the explanation of the universe to be from chance or nothing. We are saying in this argument that only contingent beings, human persons, and everything else, such as the universe, needs a cause. A necessary being does not stand in any need of any cause for its existence because it exists necessarily. It cannot fail to exist. Therefore, if the universe consists of time, space, and matter, whatever caused the universe is timeless, that is outside of time, spaceless, and immaterial, and therefore not part of the contingent universe. When we speak of the concept of God as a necessary being, I do not think that this is incoherent, nor is it a contradiction. Nor do I think that using necessity of any proposition is merely a conventional determining factor, as if we would just pick out and choose words that are to our liking. One has to choose. Either God exists or he does not. It cannot be the case that God both exists and does not exist. But there are problems on the atheist side to say that there is no God. They have to show why there is no God. They have to give us reasons as to why there is no God. And those reasons have to be logically consistent and coherent to what we know of reality. To argue for chance, or worse, caused by nothing, that is uncaused, as a causal force for the existence of all matter, time, and space, is metaphysically what we know in principle, logically what we know intuitively, and epistemologically what we know both by the reality of the external world and with our own sense datums, absurd. Being cannot come from non-being. How do we get here? In absolute nothingness, nothing exists. And as Aristotle points out in his Physics, in order to cause an effect, there must be potentiality to actualize that effect. Chance does not have the potentiality to actualize a real causal effect in the structural time-space continuum known as a contingent universe. The Parmenidean problem of coming into being, then, is quite a problem for those who hold that all matter, time, and space came into being or existence by nothing. We seek adequate answers to causal phenomenon of many things we know in our world. That's how scientific explanation works. The universe is no different, and it is even an event itself. And if it's an event, then it's an effect. And if it's an effect, then it needs a cause, in whose causal existence cannot be prior to its own existence. Effects cannot be prior to their causes. So then, a causal initiator outside the universe adequately deals with the explanation of why there is not nothing. If we're saying that the universe is contingent, and it is, and if we're saying that the universe is the event, and for some it's the first event, then it is an effect, and effects always have causes to them. And if it's contingent always has, in its existence, something that is necessary. And I'm going to tell you that necessary existence that in which the causal universe is dependent upon is God. Since God is capable of creating such a universe as he ontologically transcends it. Metaphysically speaking, it is metaphysically possible that we have our existence or being from God, a necessary being in every possible world, and who actualizes our being or existence by his existing of necessity. This is metaphysically possible, and it's not incoherent. It answers that metaphysical problem. Why is there not nothing? Why is there something? And the only way, the logical, coherent way, is that there is an existent God who exists and who cannot fail to exist, and whose our existence and being are dependent upon. So God must be a being, a non-material, and having personality. Since the universe is a material entity, and since human persons are here, the cause of such must be greater than its material effect. And since we have personality, then the cause of such beings and personality must also have being in himself and also have a personality, that is personhood. To put the argument together, and let's end. God is something which none greater can be conceived. Since it is greater to exist in reality than in the mind, therefore God must exist. Otherwise he would not qualify as the greatest conceivable being, that is God. God, then, the greatest conceivable being, existing logically, metaphysically necessary, is the grounding of all material being, the universe, and as the originating and sustaining cause, and as the cause of conscious beings. Since we are not our thoughts, nor our decisions, nor essentially our bodies, our brains, our neuronal inputs and outputs, firings of the neuron systems, but our immaterial persons, and that thus is our soul, I can have knowledge of my own mental states, the contents of my own consciousness by first-person direct introspective knowledge. How is it that I can know, if I'm a purely physical being, how is it that I can know my own mental states? Philosophically, methodological naturalism is not capable of answering these two questions: how the contingent universe began to exist and the existence of human consciousness. So then, the theistic hypothesis gives us a better explanation, having internal, external coherence and consistency of what we in fact do experience in our reality. Must we decide on a correct definition or understanding of God? Yes. To have a coherent of any worldview, then the truth must correspond with what we know in our reality, and that truth must be established. Our conception of God from philosophy of religion and revealed truths as in Scripture fits nicely with the phenomena that we have and know about in our universe and of human persons. Metaphysically, God is an is of identity. He is God, a divine being, an immaterial person with maximally great powers or properties. Elton Trueblood, in his book, in his Philosophy of Religion, writes, "To say that God is means to give assent to the proposition that the idea of God is not merely an idea in the minds of men, but actually refers to what is objectively the case, the evidence that the idea has objective reference. We cannot have a relativistic idea of God. Relativism is also self-defeating. If one claims that there are no objective standards of truth, then who's to say that that claim, there are no objective standards of truth, is true? Not only that, but the statement asserts an objective conclusion in favor of their very own position, that of relativism. But the relativist starting point is that objective standards of truth, such as moral values and duties, are false. Relativism is self-defeating. So someone cannot say, well, it doesn't matter what your opinion or view of God is. Yes, it does, because truth does matter. Oh, it doesn't matter what you believe about ethics. Yes, it does, because truth does matter. Well, if everything is relative, no, it's not, because you assert that everything is relative. Therefore, you're trying to assert that something's true. And if you're asserting that something's true, you're asserting an objective reality that you hold to and that you want others to hold on to. Atheistic naturalism is inconsistent and self-defeating. Atheism is at a loss to explain the existence of all reality. If we truly came from nothing but matter, then any reality such as morality, values, consciousness, and so on cannot exist. Nor can we know they exist, because we cannot trust our rationality. Since we evolved through a series of unguided chance processes, mutation plus natural selection, then we cannot trust our own very senses, which came from such a process. Any such reference to morality cannot come from oneself. Any naturalistic holding onto their own rational faculties to do science must recognize that if it came from an unguided processes, then it cannot be reliable, and yet science claims to be the epitome, the paradigm of all rational truth. Christianity does very well with all of these criteria, especially as a result of the historical data of the person of Jesus of Nazareth. He really did existed, and of his bodily resurrection. Given that God exists, that intelligence and the mind of human persons capable to know such truths, and that such corresponds with our reality, that we are in very good grounds to hold that God and the Christian truth claim is what coheres logically with what we know. The universe being an effect in which effects have causal antecedents owes its origin to cause greater than its effect. Since the universe cannot have a causeless effect, then a coherent explanation is that God, a necessary being who is uncaused, is a causal agency greater than the universe, responsible for its creation and of human persons who are essentially souls. Giving us this cumulative case for atheism is not coherent for what we know in reality. Therefore, Christianity is the best worldview for the way the world really is, and in fact is not incoherent. Yes. There were, this was back in 2006. Are you guys familiar with the philosopher Anthony Flew? The first time I heard, I was aware of this philosopher, but the first time it was big news in the philosophy department that he decided to go from atheism, help me out here, Jason, to, I don't want to say belief in God. It was more of what, deism or something like that? Yeah. So Anthony Flew, he accepted that, well, he's not a Christian, but there must be a God. And his argument was the reason being is because there is the recent findings of DNA, the informational process of biological systems, such as the DNA model inside human persons. And when that was announced, I remember being in my modern philosophy class. Modern philosophy talks about Kant and Descartes. Anyways, and this student raised his hand, and he's like, "Hey, did you hear about Flu's recent decision against atheism?" And guess what the philosopher teacher said? He's like, "Oh, he's just going on in years. He's just old and doesn't know what he's talking about." And so I'm sitting there going like, we philosophers tend to analyze arguments. He just gave me a great example of what not to do in philosophy. I'm trusting this guy to teach me modern philosophy, and when a real life situation such as that comes about, because he doesn't like that decision, because he doesn't like God, because he might have valued Anthony Flew in the past, and therefore he finds out he's no longer an atheist, to hold on to his own atheism, he has to discredit it by saying, he's just old in years. Wow. So what if he was still in that same time frame and he gave a great argument at a lecture at MIT or something? Oh, he's great, but because he chose to believe. So then gradually I started to kind of like, wait, they're not the ultimate paradigm of truth. They don't stand consistent with their arguments. And then not only that, it was the cosmological argument and the argument from consciousness that really said it for me, that there was a first cause and that we are immaterial souls.
So you were intellectually honest enough to actually recognize.
Well, it was hard because my wife can attest to all this. I was really mad at her. There was a conflict going on. I wanted to hold on to my religious belief, but I also wanted to please my own senses and my own lifestyle. I wanted Christianity to be true, but it didn't fit with what I really wanted in my life. And so the only logical conclusion is I could be angry at God and the entire world. At that time, my grandpa was going through stuff. I think he actually passed away. My dad was going through stuff. My mom, a lot of things were going through. I wasn't the best student in the world. A lot of things. And the initial reaction is to attack God. And so I did an honest investigation. I was like, okay, religion seems to be a phenomenon. The Bible seems to be a phenomenon. Intellectual seems to be a phenomenon. What am I going to do with these ultimate questions? Where am I? Who am I? Where did I come from? Where am I going? And it was a very deep, honest, it was hard because I'm reading Thomas Aquinas, and he's not easy. Jason can probably attest, Thomas Aquinas isn't easy. And it wasn't, and no offense, I read no one from Apologetic Press. I didn't want to hear their answers. I wanted to know, what does the philosophers say? So I want to hear, what does Descartes say? I want to hear what Thomas Aquinas says. I want to hear what Anselm says. I want to hear what... I didn't even bother to listen to William Lane Craig until later on in life. He's a great Christian apologist. I wanted to know, the philosophers are telling me there are no arguments for God. What are the philosophers really saying? And guess what? The philosophers, especially the field of philosophy of religion and some in the philosophy of mind, not everyone in the philosophy of mind believe that we are just our brains or machines made out of meat. There are some who are very popular, such as the Australian philosopher David Chalmers, who would say that, yeah, I believe in dualism, that we have both a body and a soul. And how do you explain the mystery of consciousness? So there are philosophers who do argue God does exist. And there are good arguments for that.